in greenhouse gas emissions, despite a 10% increase in population. Between 2007 and 2016, government facilities reduced emissions by over 11%, while the square footage of the county facilities grew by 17. More recently, 2017, 5-year update was begun, and in 2019, as you just heard from Doug, the 5-year update was adopted, or an update was adopted unanimously by the county board just last September. 3 things you're going to hear talked about through this conversation. The big overarching goals in the plan, explicitly: 1, that Arlington would be carbon neutral by 2050, that by 2035, the community would have 100% renewable electricity. In other words, the electricity serving this community would be 100% from renewable sources. And 3rd, that the government operations would be renewable electricity 50% by 2022, 2 years from now, and 100% by 2025. So that's a little bit of background for everyone out there. So who are our panelists? We got 5 great panelists. John Bloom, who describes himself as a recovering attorney, chair of E2C2, currently at the Advisory Board, Commission to the County Board on Environment and Energy Conservation. He was chair of the Energy Committee during the process of the update of the CEP and worked closely with staff and the county board during that period. Katharine Bond is with Dominion, is the Vice President of Public Policy, State and Local Affairs, and was very active this past General Assembly session down in Richmond, working toward the adoption of the Virginia Clean Economy Act. Scott Sklar, who doesn't know Scott Sklar? An Arlington gem with a beard. Mr. Solar, Net Zero Home, George Washington University professor, and also a longtime involvement with E2C2, the commission, and the Energy Committee. Rachel Sowards is the Chief Operating Officer at Rogers Consulting, which is a top-notch firm that does a lot of land use planning and engineering and works a lot with the development community and local governments in that process. And finally, Ivy Main, 12 years, very active with the Sierra Club, the State Sierra Club, Renewable Energy Chair, Conservation Chair, an advocate, a consultant, a writer, and does a blog that almost anyone that cares about these things reads on a regular basis. So now I'm going to pose the questions again. They'll be sort of by category, so I would encourage you, when we're on a topic, and I'll try to outline the general topic, when we're on a topic that interests you and you have a question, that's when you send a question in regarding that. So we'll talk about renewables, we'll talk about buildings, we'll talk about the state session this past year, we'll talk about transportation and a couple of other things. So when those come up, might be the time, if you're prompted, so interested, send a question through. Okay, first question. And this is going to be to John initially. John, you were intimately involved, probably more so than anyone else here, with the development of the update of our CEP adopted last September. What do you think is the single most important thing in the CEP update? Biggest change, most important change? John.
There we go. Yes. Thanks, Jay.
Unmute, John.
I'm learning.
There you go.
I think more than anything that's written in the plan is the paradigm shift or mental shift that it represents. The old CEP was mostly about using fossil fuels more efficiently and reducing energy use. And those things are still important, but this new plan is about getting rid of fossil fuels entirely. It's a whole different way of thinking and getting to carbon neutral.
Okay.
So I could give you some examples, but that's that just that mental shift is huge.
Anybody else want to chime in on that? All right, Katharine, I'm going to ask you a question. a lot of us read recently about the partnership between Arlington County and Dominion in creating a solar facility in Pennsylvania. That's a big deal. To my knowledge, it's the only local government to have created such a project. Tell us about it and tell us about how that relates to the Arlington Community Energy Plan and its goals.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly is a huge step forward as Arlington doesn't just establish those goals, but works to achieve them. Because it's one thing to have a plan, it's another thing to execute it. And I'd say it's a very important step in the right direction in terms of execution of that plan. You know, we're working to provide both reliable, affordable, and increasingly more sustainable energy to our customers. So regardless of whether it's the energy you get from that solar facility or the energy you get directly from the grid, it's going to be from increasingly clean sources. And as we talk more about the legislation that passed and was signed into law by the governor, I think as we look towards 2045, we're going to be, we'll have an overall energy grid in Virginia that is zero carbon. So we can talk a little bit more about that.
Well, explain to the average folk out there, though, what exactly it is doing. How is it helping Arlington accomplish the CEP goals tangibly?
So the solar facility itself is dedicated to Arlington. So for all intents and purposes, that facility is going to be dedicated to Arlington's use. The facility itself, and Ivy can speak to this probably more intelligently than just about anybody I know. It generates energy and RECs that go along with it. So basically a certificate that says not only is this energy made right here in Virginia, but it's made from a renewable energy source. And so that goes to offset anything else that's being consumed by Arlington and the energy space that may not come from similarly situated sources.
Cool. Ivy, please give everybody a little sense of the practical, how it works. Ivy?
There we go. Sorry, I was having trouble getting that unmute button to work.
There you go.
Yeah, so this is the same tool, a financing tool that corporations have used across the country. They essentially contract for a solar facility, can be anywhere, but ideally it's on the same grid and in the same state as their facilities. And the power from that doesn't necessarily have to go directly to them. That can go into the wholesale market. And then in the financial terms, it allows them to claim credit for the renewable energy placed on the grid. It's a fantastic approach. Arlington is the first locality in Virginia to do this, and we hope it'll serve as an example to others.
It's like providing a customer, sort of for a new solar farm, right?
Right.
So it helps motivate them being built. It helps give an incentive for them to be built. Is it sort of like what Amazon and Microsoft and some of the big companies are also doing?
That is exactly what they're doing. And in fact, Amazon is also taking most of the electricity from this solar farm. So it's a good partnership.
Right.
Yeah, and I would just highlight the importance of that is that it helps Arlington achieve economies of scale that it would not ordinarily be able to achieve on its own, because in this space, the fact that Amazon is participating too means a larger installation and a lower overall cost to Arlington than if it were a standalone installation.
Mm-hmm. And part of the goal in the CEP is that the county government will have non-fossil fuel clean electricity by 2022 or 2025. Mm-hmm. So this helps us get there, right?
Certainly.
Let me ask.
Jay, can I pop in for a second?
Scott, please.
I just want to point out to people that one of the issues that we on the Energy Committee had, and this project addresses, is we're a very small county. We have a dense population. A big part of it is the cemetery, and we're not allowed to build stuff on there so far. So being able to access solar within the state dedicated to the county was a very important step. So the fact is, when we're looking at aspirations, one of the practicalities are that most of us on the committee wanted to focus on what we do within the Arlington County boundaries, but we did realize we needed external clean energy from outside the county. And this was an extremely important step, and deserves to be acknowledged by the folks in the county and Dominion that helped cobble this together.
Right. It takes work to create such an agreement, and it also can be a model for others. So let me ask you guys this, and any one of you that would like to can respond, but the Arlington CEP set as a goal carbon neutrality for the entire community by 2050. And there are people that it was a big conversation point. Some are very skeptical. And to date, the plan itself still falls short of showing how we would get those final reductions. What is your view of the likelihood of success? And for example, what might the role of new technology or future technologies be in reaching that goal?
If I might be the snaggly
You're on the screen. You're on the screen, Scott. You keep going.
Okay, I just sort of say, before we look at new technology, I think it's very important, and we on the committee have been sort of agitating on this, that it's very important that people understand most of our energy is used in buildings, and how buildings are built, and the zoning that drives those buildings, and the concessions and negotiations about those buildings are very, very critical. And so we are pushing and hoping that the county itself, along with other like cities and counties in Virginia, push for stronger building codes, because remember, buildings that are built now are around 60 to 100 years. And so the building codes really matter. And big cities like Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C. are doing stretch building codes, in fact, offering incentives to builders that if they go beyond the building code, they'll get approved faster. So we've seen the board approve some things recently after they unanimously approved the energy plan that they were not as far reaching as we would hope in the voluntary green codes, forget driving new ones. And then I think secondly, the whole issue of creating some other incentives or drivers. We have a CPACE program for commercial buildings that is great, but has not been driven in a lot of projects. And we need the county to sort of work with us on that. So I'm just stressing that before we jump to new technology, we really have to look at what are the tools we have and how do we drive the market and the players to row together. And it's not just the utility, it's actually the builders and the developers that we really need to drive. So
I'm going to get to the building section where we're going to transition right to that next. But does anyone else want to comment on, this gets a little bit to plans and whether they're aspirational or just practical and can be done today. Anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in and say, I think that the debate is interesting for sure. And, you know, how do we bridge the last 14% or whatever that math looks like right now? I think that we really need to sort of embrace the not knowing. And I think that's an okay thing to include in a plan that has 30 years attached to it. I think that many of us would have trouble sort of dictating exactly every percentage of our life for the next 30 years. So I think that that's a safe place for us to be. And I think it's a particularly important sort of as we talk about policy and what we're trying to achieve, that we don't wait to have all the solutions. I think that we all know what happens there, you know, paralysis, right? We don't get anywhere. I think that new technologies are going to continue to evolve. We sort of know that intuitively. We're in this moment right now where we couldn't have done this if this had happened 15 years ago because this technology didn't exist, right? So I think that we should expect to see more technology, but I think the point made about the technologies we have right now being put into use is extremely important to
Great.
keep on the table.
Rachel, I appreciate that answer.
And I would agree with both. Yeah,
Go ahead, Katharine.
yeah, I would concur with both Rachel and Scott's points. And as we established net zero goals for the company, that both of those were factors that were considered. What does today's technology look like, and should we wait for the technology to allow us to absolutely know with certainty how we're going to achieve that final 10, 15, maybe 5%? And the answer is no, because we know that there will be technological innovation that will help us to get there. It's going to take working across sectors too, which is probably a very important point to make, that Arlington has acknowledged that when you look across, for example, the transportation and the energy sector, there are synergies and carbon savings that can be achieved by looking across sectors, for example.
Very good.
I think just one, sorry, go ahead, John.
Oh, well, I was going to agree that predicting the future is really difficult, especially right now. We don't even know when schools are going to open, much less what's going to happen in 2050. But the thing about this debate, and a point that I think played a role in the decision, was a realization. I think there were people who wanted this certainty that we can't provide in 2050, exactly what's going to happen. And one of the points that I think was helpful was to understand that, that's not what a goal is. If you're certain you're going to get there, it's not a goal. It's more a prediction or a forecast. Mm. And so it is an ambitious goal. I think we're going to get there. What I'm really worried about is what we do in the 2020s anyway. And because what we do now is so incredibly important, more important than what we do 10 years from now, really. And Bill McKibben's quote is something that I think about every day. That is that winning slowly at climate is the same as losing. So I'm more concerned about right now, and really curious about exactly how those last few percent are going to work out.
All right, I'm ready to go on. I'm going to go into buildings a little bit. Thank you for those comments. Multifamily and commercial buildings really are a big source of our energy here in Arlington. Not so in every community, a more rural place, but they are here. It's the heating, the cooling, the lighting, etc. So let me ask Rachel this question first. You've spent a lot of time with developers. What is the best way for developers to help reduce building emissions? And what does our CEP call for in that regard?
Yeah, so the CEP has a pretty aggressive reduction on the building side. 38% is what the target is by 2050. But I think more important than the percent reduction is really what are the best ways for developers to address this challenge and be part of the solution. There's a couple different answers, right? One is that there's a developer role, which is new buildings, right, being put online, designing and sort of facilitating that process, new codes. And I think some of the things that Scott mentioned sort of apply to that piece of it. And then there's the people who own and operate the properties, which aren't always the same people. Enter one of our first challenges, right? And so I think the best way for them to sort of, for that group as a whole, is through technology, through incentive programs, through mandates from a code perspective and upgrade perspective. But I think there's a whole value proposition in the private sector around who wants to be in these buildings and what are they looking for that also drives owner behavior. I didn't have a lot of success going to developers and making what might be considered sort of the good person argument, right? That didn't necessarily win the day, but relating it to their bottom line as far as being able to lease apartments, being able to lease space, being able to get approvals, being able to get through a process with more certainty, tax incentive reductions, all those sorts of things, those are very attractive. So I think depending on the audience and who's trying to sort of be lured into to the mission of reducing building emissions, you got to speak their language and sort of address their particular needs. And I think there's a lot of programs specifically in Arlington, that move that along, but there's a lot of work left to be done there.
You know, the interesting thing is in the heating and cooling, if you're using electricity and we're moving renewables in to create electricity, that's kind of covered. And there's then the question of gas, right? My understanding is California, which is a leader in all this, has really begun moving to a place where they're prohibiting in the future natural gas being part of new buildings as well. So is that part of our CEP? Was that even discussed? And I don't know if John, maybe you're the best one to respond to that in terms of being involved with the creation of the update.
So
The role of natural gas.
yeah, I can talk a little bit about that, and maybe others want to chime in. But the idea of prohibiting gas is probably not under discussion here in Virginia right now, or anytime soon, I'd say. But the concept of electrification is big, and it is in the plan, even though the word isn't in the plan. And just for people who may not be familiar with it, that's electrification means shifting space heating, water heating, cooking from gas to electricity, and electricity is already cleaner for most uses and becoming cleaner every year. So so that shift over time, gets us where we want to go. And a lot of people really don't understand the advances that have been made in kind of electric heat pumps, both ground source and air source, water heaters, conduction, electric cooking. Going all electric is really very feasible now, and the CEP definitely looks at that as one of the strategies.
So the building codes themselves, and maybe Scott or Rachel could respond to this, but who has the authority in Virginia to set those building codes?
Well, the state, we're a Dillon Rule state, so the state government has control over building codes. Many of us are trying to push the idea, not only to pressure them to follow some other states that have adopted the more modern building codes, but to maybe give some flexibility to cities and counties in the state that have established plans to move to the new ones as a trial or something to help drive the agenda, give some flexibility. But the state, in fact, is the sole control. So either we need a significant push by a lot of the actors that helped get not only the clean energy plan here, but the wonderful new move in Richmond on those energy initiatives to go and adopt the most current building codes, or create some pressure valve so some of us that have local aspirations can do it. But I want to make clear, and why I brought it up, I guess, a little earlier than you wanted it, Jay, was we cannot get there without more efficient buildings, period. And so we need to figure that out. And secondly, the one initiative we have, which is the CPACE program, is fundamentally not operational because we haven't worked out a deal yet on how to back up the lenders on the innovations with the imprimatur of the county. So we're in a detailed dialogue on that. But we need to get over that, and we need to make that happen.
I'm gonna head back
money
to
talks.
I agree with you on the CPACE. The county board needs to amend that policy to make it work. But let me go to Rachel on something that Scott just said. Scott just talked about the building codes, and clearly in Arlington, the only thing we can do is incentivize and voluntarily get a developer to do better than the code. And they get some density for that, for example.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think the developers would feel if that authority were relegated to cities to require something beyond the existing code or beyond the state code?
Well, I mean, I think that you're, sort of in the general sense, you can probably anticipate your standard sort of pushback, right? Because keep it easy on us and make it streamlined, and we already have it baked in, and we shouldn't have to modify our process if we're building in Richmond or if we're building in Arlington. Like, I get that, right? Like, it's not a unreasonable or illogical argument. It doesn't really help this particular point, right? But I think that you could expect that from a general population. That said, I think that there are active developers, especially in the Arlington, the DC metro, and sophisticated markets that would absolutely sort of, maybe not champion, but definitely understand and go along with that kind of change. Excuse me. I mean, they want to build buildings in Arlington because they can make a lot of money in buildings in Arlington, because it's a place where lots of really intellectually driven, ambitious, sort of successful people live, right? I mean, this is all sort of an ecosystem. And so I think when you're thinking about sort of how the developer would react or what's the incentive, everybody sort of has the win place in the cycle. It's just a matter of speaking directly to it. I do want to say, I think the financing piece is so important. And I think that it's not sexy, it's not interesting technology necessarily, but I think that it's one of the biggest sort of fundamental things that has to get addressed across the board in order to make these kinds of projects more viable.
Yeah. I think the short of it is the development community would probably go to Richmond and fight any of that delegation to the cities for the reasons you cited. Let me skip to the state now. And we've gotten a few questions in, and a few of them are going to be relevant as we enter some of these next topics. But, let me turn to Ivy first, and Katharine maybe, who spent the most time down in Richmond working on a lot of legislation. There were many pieces passed. The sort of big one was the Virginia Clean Economy Act. And let me first ask Ivy if you could, in abbreviated form, outline some of the key elements of this really transformational bill that finally passed the General Assembly.
Okay, well, the most important thing is that it provides a pathway to reach zero carbon in the electric sector by 2045 for Dominion and 2050 for the rest of the state. And it works with a separate bill to put us into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative to lower carbon emissions. So we're doing this through auction allowances. But the Clean Economy Act also requires a massive build out of wind and solar as one of the ways to reach our carbon reduction targets. In addition, it requires closing a couple of coal units and oil-fired units. So it is actually pushing fossil fuels to close down, as well as Dominion's biomass plants. It's got a 2-year moratorium on new fossil fuel plants, and it makes it's got various provisions in there that make it very difficult to build another fossil fuel plant.
Including
so all of these
natural
things
gas?
together.
Including natural gas.
Yes. It's Katharine was actually in those negotiations and can speak to this much better than I can. But there are a lot of guardrails around any new provisions for natural gas.
Katharine, could you supplement that?
Sure, I'm happy to do so. There are certain considerations that have to be made, including environmental justice and other considerations. The legislation does specify that reliability is still a primary consideration when it comes to providing electric service. And so, we've talked about the need for technological improvements, and the State Corporation Commission and others will weigh in to the extent there's any applications that are made as to whether or not they're needed for reliability purposes. And we'll certainly factor in the legislation specifying when those facilities need to be retired if it weren't for reliability purposes. But I'll hit on a couple of other key points. I think
points.
Ivy mentioned RGGI being included in the legislation.
Tell everyone what RGGI is, please.
So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is a multi-state carbon trading program. So in order to emit carbon, you have to purchase allowances. The cost of those allowances get passed on to electric customers, and the proceeds from those allowances now, with the legislation that passed this year, will then be funneled to the state to appropriate for things like energy efficiency and other investments. Other states have undertaken different types of investments, so that'll be up to the Commonwealth to decide. So Virginia will join this multi-state regional carbon trading program called RGGI. It includes other Northeast states. We're the southernmost state that will be part of RGGI. One piece of legislation that passed has Virginia joining RGGI through 2030. The Virginia Clean Economy Act takes that participation out through 2050. The legislation also specifies, and Scott talked a lot today about energy efficiency. It specifies and actually mandates certain levels of energy efficiency related savings that are required on the part of the utility. In prior years, there was a mandate for a certain amount of applications that were centered around the money spent as opposed to the energy saved. So that's a transition that occurs in this legislation, is that it mandates energy savings. It also will bring substantially more renewable energy to Virginia, both large scale and small scale. From Arlington's perspective, I think that's important because, as you mentioned, it's relatively small in terms of land area. And if somebody were to say, hey, I'd love to find 500 acres in Arlington to put up a big solar farm, then that would certainly be much more challenging than it might be in other areas of the Commonwealth. But the legislation specifies both large and small scale solar, as well as onshore and offshore wind, are in the public interest, which is really important because they have to compete with each other. So we have to, in undertaking those programs and those projects, prove that we've done it in the most cost-effective way for our customers. So we don't have to prove that solar is better than natural gas, for example, or that one technology is superior to another. It's just that we have to demonstrate that we've taken on those investments in the most cost-effective ways possible. So substantially more solar. What this equates to is for the next 10 to 15 years, we're talking about 10,000 acres of additional solar every year for at least the next 10 years in order to achieve these goals, if not more than that. It also finds offshore wind in the public interest, which is an absolute game changer for the Commonwealth. There are lots of companies that are looking to the United States as offshore wind comes to the United States. There's one 5-turbine project that's operational today, and we're super excited. This is a great time for this conversation because the pilot project off of Virginia, the ship that is bringing those turbines to Virginia has left its port and is actually on its way to off the coast of Virginia, where construction will commence within the next couple of weeks. And
can I interrupt you?
Yeah, please.
Can I just interrupt you to comment that one of the big arguments I'm aware of for this bill in Richmond was the economic, the jobs it would generate, because a lot of people are making the argument that creating these goals and these targets and requirements will generate a whole new clean energy economy in the Commonwealth, which Dominion will obviously benefit from, but there's also competition that will come from that will help move everyone forward. Can I ask any of you that would like to speak to the solar? We have a couple questions that have come in regarding distributed solar. Rooftop solar is what most people think about on their homes, for example. And the questions are around what is Dominion's position on bringing as much rooftop solar as public demand will support? And then another question about could Arlington provide significant incentives for residential rooftop solar, and would it be practical enough to make any real difference in reaching our goals? So maybe you could start, Katharine, in responding to that, and then we'll go with Scott and Ivy.
Yeah, so the last provision, actually, the legislation I was going to mention is that it also substantially increases the net metering, the amount of net metering that is available in the Commonwealth. And so net metering typically are the distributed generation, the smaller systems that you see predominantly on rooftops, but they don't always have to be, but are tied into a customer's system to help offset their usage on site. So I would think we would see substantially more solar. One thing we haven't talked about, we haven't spent really any time talking about COVID, but I do think as, you know, we all figure out as a society and as a Commonwealth what normal looks like coming out of the COVID crisis, it's going to be jobs that get our economy back up and running. And certainly there's an awful lot of potential here in this enabling legislation to enable exactly what the legislation is called, and that is the Clean Economy Act, the Virginia Clean Economy Act. And so I think there's a tremendous potential for job creation and investment here in Virginia, and we're excited to be part of it.
Scott, Ivy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different kinds of rooftop options. One, obviously, Arlington is already supporting, which is the solar co-op, and Virginia Sun is working on that, and it allows consumers to band together with a installer and get lower cost installations. We already talked about CPACE for the commercial rooftops. Community solar is approved, though not as flexible in Virginia as, let's say, Washington, D.C. or Maryland, where you can have more private sector approaches to band together using lots of rooftops or even land, ground-mounted solar. And that's something we need to incentivize and enhance. And lastly, we just have a report on from Virginia Clean Energy and Community Choice Aggregation, which allows municipalities by right, it's legal, their study just came out, saying that municipalities have the right to bring in green energy and make it available to sets of consumers. And so we need to use all those kinds of tools to and look at what other municipalities and counties have done around the United States to drive that. And a lot of that is not just regulations, but how do you attract capital and make this pay out and be affordable? So the details matter. But can we do a lot of it? Absolutely we can. And we just need to create tactics to drive that. And we hope the CEP implementation plan will have some of that. And of course, John Bloom and others will be watching to make sure that happens.
And for those that don't know, this is the man speaking who has a net zero home. Ivy Main, your comment on that? Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, so the net metering provisions in the Clean Economy Act and in the Solar Freedom Bill remove a whole lot of barriers to rooftop solar, but it doesn't help prioritize rooftop solar for the state, and that's an issue. As Katharine says, we're talking about a whole lot of acreage if you're just relying on utility scale solar, whereas we know we've got rooftops everywhere that could be hosting solar. We've got closed landfills, we've got closed mine sites, other brownfields. We need to do something to make those a priority. At the moment, solar farms, the big utility scale projects, are the cheapest way to do solar. But from the point of view of the public good, they are not necessarily it doesn't take account of all of the other considerations of the efficiency of simply having solar on an otherwise unused roof.
Right.
So that is something we still need to deal with in order to incentivize that kind of solar in the future.
And speaking directly to Arlington, and then we're going to move on to transportation, but clearly Arlington set the stage, or was one of the first with our schools putting PPAs on rooftops, solar arrays on rooftops. And we now have, I think, 3 net zero schools, one maybe being built, a community center. So maybe John, that you could speak to the question about Arlington specific. Do you see opportunities in Arlington, either from the VCEA or otherwise for rooftop solar?
Yeah, we have great opportunities here, and really thanks to the new legislation. There were opportunities before, but the Solar Freedom Bill that Ivy worked so hard on the last couple of years removes 7-8 different barriers to distributed solar, to rooftop solar, to community solar. So there are, there are opportunities now for multifamily apartment buildings to get solar. Through community solar, there are opportunities now for people, a lot of Arlington is heavily shaded and a lot of rooftops don't work. Those people can as soon as the program rolls out, look to community solar as an alternative.
Okay.
And so on. So yeah.
John, let me stick with you and segue to transportation. So what does the update to our community energy plan say about transportation?
I'd say to greatly simplify, it says two things. First, Arlington's been a leader in multimodal transportation and smart growth, focusing development along transit lines. And it's been doing that for 30, 40 years. And so we need to keep working on that, reducing the total miles driven, getting people out of their cars when they live in an environment that doesn't require a car. So all that's great, but I'd say what this plan adds on top of that is to say, well, there's still a lot of, last time I checked, a lot of cars out on the road, and we need to electrify our entire transportation systems, cars, buses, school buses, transit buses, trucks eventually. And so that's the kind of the new layer, and starting with county government. We've been having
John,
conversations.
I'm going to interrupt. What keeps Arlington right now from saying we won't buy another county sedan unless it's electric?
There is nothing other than will. And, John Bloom, by the way, has asked that question on the committee several times. So we all believe the county needs to stand up. We already know that electric buses and other vehicles can be financed so that the monthly cost of the vehicle, including the electricity, is less than the fuel and the operation and maintenance of a traditional vehicle. And cities and counties are doing it all over the United States. So we need to push us faster and further while Scott Sklar here is still alive to do that. Is my
and let me just add, because we have given county staff kind of a hard time, and we need to give them credit because the budget they just passed includes 27 new EV sedans, bringing the total up to about 38 or so, which is, it's a good start. It's really, and in tough budget times, remarkable. So we're making a start in that direction.
Yeah, and if it's possible, Jay, I'd like to just highlight.
Please, Rachel. Is that Rachel? Who was speaking?
Katharine?
Katharine, I was going to segue to you because along with
yeah, this is Katharine. Yeah,
Right.
I just wanted to highlight. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight.
You got it.
School buses. We got to talk about school buses. Yeah. So we're really excited that Arlington's going to be participating as one of the first school districts to receive 2 school buses through Dominion's electric school bus pilot program, the first step. And again, looking across sectors. So in this case, we're looking across both transportation, energy, and education, and working together to determine how these electric buses can not only provide a phenomenal option related to emissions-free transportation of students and significantly improving the air quality versus diesel buses. As you mentioned, providing significant fuel and operating and maintenance cost savings for localities, but then also being innovative in the way that we look at how these buses, when being charged together, always ensuring that safe transportation of students is the top priority, but how that can also be used as a grid balancing device. And again, working together with storage, the energy storage that's contained in the batteries in the buses, and how the grid and the buses and transportation of students can all sort of work together on a small scale, so we can figure out how best to deploy that on a larger scale going forward.
I really want to thank John and Scott and everybody that's worked on pushing the transportation element of the Arlington CEP, because you're right, in my view, Arlington is a leader in transportation and multimodal choices and smart growth, and we've done an amazing job. That said, it's probably one of the weaker parts of the current energy plan. You know, we have to continue doing all the things we did, but we also have to electrify. And there's, I think, John, they're doing a report. I think they sort of punted it to a report over the next couple of years, but we'll see where that goes. And this is an opportunity for Dominion and local governments to partner, right? To get those diesel buses to be electric. So I got a question for all of you right now. And this is a teed up question from me. Does anyone feel that it is appropriate or even factually accurate for all of Arlington's art buses to advertise the slogan, quote, "powered by clean natural gas"? Would anyone like to defend that?
Yeah, I have a defense for it, Jay.
Oh,
Because
go
if it said powered by fracking, nobody would get on the bus.
That is better branding.
Okay.
That's true.
All right. Well, let's see where that goes. Maybe somebody will have heard that again. So social justice. Let me raise that question. I believe one of the big changes and more prominent in this update of the CEP is social justice. And I know that was a big part of the conversation in Richmond around the Virginia Clean Economy Act. Would anyone like to speak to how you believe that is embedded in the current energy plan? Because some people get anxious. It's going to become more expensive, right?
Well, I guess I'll take a stab. You know, we have a big thrust on energy efficiency, as has the county even before the energy plan. And energy efficiency, as everyone knows, I'll put my professor hat, it's always less expensive to save energy than generate it from any source. And so part of the deal for everyone, including lower income, is to more aggressively do that. And one of the chides I have on the county and all of us actually is there are lots of programs out there where lots of resources, both from the federal government, in some cases the state, and a lot of private investor types to finance that so that it's absolutely affordable. It's cash positive the way we do it. Some states are adopting, by the way, on-bill financing. So the utility gets a fee, becomes a bank, but allows the renter to invest in their apartment or in their small business as well. Right. So that's one way. And then the second way is the solar co-op. And there's no question we need to create some other financing tools that, again, are spread across end users so that we don't forget that the lower income side has just the same right to clean, reliable energy as anybody else. So we have some work to do, but the pieces are there.
Anybody else?
So I'll start with that.
Thank you, Scott. Anyone else?
Well, I'll just say, just as an overview, just that the ideas for equity to be embedded and to be a lens through which every aspect of the plan is seen, and you know, with the understanding being that the burdens and benefits of this move to carbon neutrality need to be shared fairly and equitably across society. So, you know, if you're rolling out electric buses and reducing and improving the air quality, you need to do that, you know, to make sure that they're serving the areas where the air quality is the worst and where they can do the most good and that sort of thing. So there are just all kinds of ways to implement this equity lens.
I think both of you have commented on it, and Ivy and Katharine spoke to the energy efficiency elements of the state legislation. But many people think much of the RGGI revenue from the state will go toward energy efficiency in low and moderate income communities and homes. And I think for a lot of people, improved energy efficiency is a way of helping to promote equity. Because even though we've had low rates in Virginia, we've tended to have some of the highest bills in the country. So as Dominion becomes more efficient and reduces demand, that will also help people of low and moderate income. So we had a question I'm reading to just jump back momentarily to transportation. Somebody raised that there were 37 electric sedans in our fleet being ordered. And the question is, what percentage of our fleet is that? How many vehicles are typically purchased annually? I mean, is that a large percentage or small percentage is the question.
I think it's a modest percentage. I've heard something like a quarter, but it might be a third. It might be it's somewhere in that.
Of the total,
it's a substantial percentage, but certainly not a majority. We're not close to that.
One thing to find out is whether it's 100% of what was ordered this year, or whether, because you can't replace every vehicle. You have to wait till the time is up to replace it. So we don't know exactly, but it's not insubstantial. One of you mentioned, I think, Katharine, about COVID. And of course, any forum like this should raise that question. We've just been living through a very different time, and we're going to come out of it in a very different way. So the question is, what is the impact of COVID-19 on the community energy plan's implementation in your view? And any one of you that has a brief, kind of thought about what that might be, please go ahead. John, you're on the screen. Why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'll take a pass because I'm still trying to figure it out.
Anybody want to comment? Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that none of us really know what normal is going to look like. And when, Scott's brought up energy efficiency, but when will we be in a place, not if, but when will we be in a place where energy efficiency providers can pass freely in and out of people's homes comfortably? And so, we've got to figure out as a society, what normal looks like again. And I think the goals that are set forth have a long enough runway that Arlington will achieve its goals, and the Commonwealth will achieve its goals, Dominion will achieve its goals. And it could be that, I think, we're going to be resilient in this, and it will happen, whether it happens in the the near term. If there are milestones in the very near term in the next couple months, that might yet be to be determined, but we'll get there.
Rachel, I'm curious what you might have to say about this, or what the private sector may be thinking.
Yeah, so I think that like everybody, we're sort of struggling to figure out what will be the new normal, right? There's a lot of conversation around, is there going to be a new pull to the suburbs? Is it going to change the way people are thinking about transit-oriented development? Is it going to change the footprint? Is it going to change the square footage requirements? Are all of a sudden the idea of an open office going to be passé? And what's the ripple effect from a design and construction perspective? All of those sorts of questions are on the table, and there's just more analysts than you can count trying to sort of predict, right, and think about where the puck is going and do all that jazz. So I think there's a lot of unknowns. I think for me, from my perspective, and based on my experience, is that there's going to be an opportunity, when this passes, we're going to have a lot of work to do, right? There's going to be need for jobs. There's going to be need for a new economy, a greener economy. How we deal with climate change, what lessons we learn from a complete shutdown from an ecological perspective. There's so much data being gathered right now, sociologically and anthropologically and biologically, that I think we're not there to process it yet. But I know that it's all going to change. And I think that we have an opportunity to look at a plan like this and look at an implementation process and say, what are the things that are going to help us advance this and move it forward in a really positive way? And I think ultimately, you know, amongst the sadness and the difficulty of all of this, there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of opportunity if we can sort of push the momentum in the direction that we all think we need to move it in to achieve what we need to achieve. So I'm optimistic, I guess.
From my point of view, because I work in the private sector and I help run 2 different financial think tanks, both looking at natural capital and climate change. What we see is one's Planet Tracker, which is a sister association of Carbon Track. Another one's 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. I'm the chair of the board. What we see is many pension funds and other institutions who are managing assets on behalf of, you know, communities such as Arlington, stress testing their portfolios for climate risk and even for COVID. And there are free stress testing tools out there. I mean, Mark Carney at the Bank of England, you know, has used our tool, and they got the whole insurance sector in the UK, the stress test their portfolios, for example. So what worries me is the midterm and long-term risk that Arlington County is not stress testing its pension portfolio. It's not stress testing its retirement accounts. That, you know, many of you have worked for a county, and so, you know, when you go to retire or you go on to your next role and you think you'll have X amount of dollars, you're going to have a lot less dollars because the portfolio managers are not being asked to stress test those assets for climate risk.
Hey, Gabriel.
Yes, Jay.
I'm sorry, but the questions, everyone's going like, who's he? Where did he come from? This is a guy who's been an active volunteer in Arlington on these issues and on some of these committees. But if you don't mind, all the questions and comments are supposed to be through the chat.
Yeah, so go ahead and send your chat, Gabriel. Thank you so much. If you just want to, if you have any questions, all of you, please send your questions via chat to Carter Room, and as soon as I get them, I relay them on to Jay. Thanks very much.
I'm going to end with just 2 other questions, sort of broadly for any of the panelists that want to. And Gabriel, thanks, because that made a lot of sense, actually. The first question is, for everyone out there that's in Arlington, for our residents, for community members, what's the best way for people in the community to help the plan succeed? What could they do? And you get this question all the time. It's not always an easy one, but what can an individual do? Any suggestions?
I guess I'll start that. And again, it sounds trite, but personal decisions matter in your home and business. And again, the first thing you can do is energy efficiency, whether that's LED light bulbs, putting smart thermostats, timers, unplug things that are not used, like the TV in your guest room that's drawing energy when it's turned off, all those kind of things. And of course, when you renovate your building with the best insulation, the best windows, all of those things. So those are the things, the choices you can make. And obviously the transportation choices are somewhat similar. Walking, biking are still the lowest cost, lowest carbon ways to go. And Arlington's done a lot to promote it. So I guess I'll just push the mundane stuff, but if everybody did it, the impact on the climate, the lowering of the costs everybody pays, and the pollution levels lower is profound.
Thanks, Scott.
I'll just take a slightly different tack, and I'll say yes to what Scott just said, but my pitch is that elections matter and policies matter. And so vote, contribute generously, vote locally and at the state level and the federal level. Look for those candidates who will deliver on climate.
And add to that. Rachel, you go ahead. You were.
Oh, no, please.
Oh, all right. Well, I was just going to say here to both Scott and John, but also the reason that we got the Clean Economy Act and solar freedom and the Reggie bill passed is that we had huge participation from the grassroots, as well as the election. The election was huge, that mattered, but it was the fact that so many people stuck around to push the policies that actually got it through. The Clean Economy Act passed by a squeaker, and it was hundreds of volunteers, maybe thousands. There were an awful lot of people really hammering the delegates and the senators right up to the last moment to get the deals done. And there is such a role for citizens to play in legislation, and this year proved it.
For all of you, just as a plug for Ivy, her blog is consistent with her message. It's called powerforthepeopleva.com. Okay, now we're moving on to
Thanks, Jay.
Katharine or Rachel? Rachel, why don't you go first?
I was just gonna say that everything that's been said, but I would just one neighbor, like get one of your neighbors to do something more. Get them more engaged, get them to join you on this kind of a phone call, get them to make a phone call, get them to go for a walk or replace their light bulb. But just think about one neighbor, right? We're sort of in this moment of virus, right? We're contact, and we're all sort of thinking about that, but there's a lot of good positive contacts. And I think getting that one neighbor sort of mentality can really help grow the movement.
Katharine?
I think the rest of the panelists have covered your question.
Okay, so the last question to all of you is your last opportunity to share a thought on any of the areas we just talked about, but what's a takeaway message or a message that you would really like to leave people with on anything regarding the energy plan, the climate challenge, Arlington's ability, their ability to make a difference and implement what we've put forward as goals. Katharine, you're on the screen.
Jay, I think first of all, kudos for you of being on the Arlington County Board and setting this community energy plan process in motion. And that was actually very important. It went further, way more than I ever thought it would do. But I want to point out that this is a historic issue of climate change. This is going to affect everybody, and it also drives the pandemic and those kinds of environments as well. So we as a family have to look at this, that individual actions, political and personal, drive our future. And I just hope everybody on this webinar takes that to heart and takes that challenge.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is Katharine. I will just add to that and say, first of all, thank you to Arlington for being a thought leader. And we look forward to moving through the next phase with you as partners in the implementation of your plans and achieving the goals that you've set forth for the county, and appreciate the opportunity to participate in this discussion and in your achievement of your energy goals.
Thank you, Katharine. Next.
I'll just say, I think we should look around and see how quickly we can make change when we have to. And I think on climate, we have to. And I'll come back to Bill McKibben's line that winning slowly on climate is the same as losing. So we need to, act quickly and with purpose. And thanks.
Thank you, John. Who does that leave? Rachel and Ivy?
Yeah, I'd say here to everything that's been said. I think John really captured it well. We know what can happen when we all act together and quickly, and I think that it's a good roadmap for what the challenges are that we face next. And I'm encouraged by all the work that's been done and being done, and I think optimism leads the day.
Thank you, Ivy.
Yep. Arlington's gonna do this, and it's not just gonna be a cleaner and lower carbon community, but it's also going to be one that everybody's going to want to move to, because it's going to be more walkable and cleaner and just a much more dynamic place to be. It's so I really give a lot of credit to Scott and John and you and all the rest who worked on this.
All right, everybody. Thank you to the panel. And let me just tie it up by saying that thanks to the Arlington Democrats and the Young Democrats for hosting this. The energy plan was adopted, the update in September, but now they are working on the implementation plan. The energy plan itself is the aspiration, the goals, the 2050 and some shorter term targets in between now and then. But the implementation plan are the tools and the new policies that will be needed and the new incentives that will be needed to help make that a reality. Some of those can be done now. We have control over our fleets. We don't have control over our building codes. We do have control over X. We don't have control over Y. Maybe we'll get some of that control from the legislature. So some of the tools will have to yet be generated. But that implementation plan will be coming up before the county board at some point, probably by the fourth quarter of this year. So watch it, keep in touch with it, and help shape it yourselves. The budget, it's always, a lot of things are around the money. So some of this is around the money, not all of it. And again, congratulations to Arlington for really helping to step forward and make the change that we'd like everyone to make. And we've got a long way to go, but we're on a good roll. So again, thanks to everybody, and thank you for joining us today. All right. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks to all of our panelists. We'll be signing off.